Welcome. This is the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and general explorer of the service and experience space. The thing I'm really interested in is how do we create organizations that produce better outcomes for both their customers and their people. This podcast has been running since January 2011, and so we have a big archive to explore. Check out the archive at adrianswinscoe.com. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. Before we get into the podcast, I want to give a big shout out and thanks to the folks at TextExpander for sponsoring this episode of my podcast. TextExpander is an autocomplete tool that allows your team to eliminate repetitive typing and stay on the same page with just a few keystrokes, allowing you to delight more customers in less time. Check out the link in the show notes to find out more and to get a 20% discount for the first 12 months of TextExpander if you use the code SWINSCO. Now, let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Julia Fabr McBride, who is the interim president, who's the, I won't edit this out. I'll just kind of keep it in because it just makes it feel kind of like a bit more normal. It is Julia. With me today, I have Julia Fabr McBride, who is the interim president and CEO, as well as the chief leadership development officer of the Kansas Leadership Center. Julia, thankfully I don't have to say that again. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Adrian, I'm doing really well, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Perfect. Now, so Julie, for the benefit of our listeners and kind of people that read the highlights that I produce of these interviews, can you give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch about you and the work you do? And I would like you to go all the way back to kind of how you're connected with Edinburgh too, because I think that's just probably not a very well-known fact.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was at the Edinburgh Festival in 1996 as a young actor in a company called Plasticine, and we did original works of physical theater. We developed them through improv, and this show called Door Slam got to go to the Edinburgh Festival, got a great mention in The Guardian, and actually it's one of the highlights of my career as an actor. And I transitioned in my late 30s from primarily being an actor to being a leadership coach. I moved from Chicago to Kansas right at the time that the Kansas Leadership Center was being founded. And this organization has an audacious mission around building the capacity of a state and being a model for people outside the state about how to exercise leadership on the toughest challenges.
Awesome. That's brilliant. And you told me that story about the Edinburgh Festival. And given that I'm based in Edinburgh, I thought, oh, you have to get that on tape. I mean, if there's such a thing as tape these days, it's kind of like ones and zeros.
Whatever it is that we're talking on, right?
Exactly. But the reason why you're here with me today is because I know that you've just co-authored a book with your colleague, Ed O'Malley. And it's called When Everyone Leads, How the Toughest Challenges Get Seen and Solved. Now, I love the idea about everyone leading, because I don't think leadership is a position, leadership is a behavior.
Yep.
But I'm not going to talk about that because that's all about your kind of like premise, your kind of like domain. Yep. So I wanted to ask you, can you tell me about the book, how it came about, its main thesis, and who's it for? But also, who's it not for too?
Yeah, so we've been at this work at the Kansas Leadership Center for 15 years, and our main principle is leadership is an activity. It's available to anyone, anytime, anywhere, and it starts with you and must engage others around tough challenges. And we've done a lot of writing. My co-author, Ed, has written a book called Your Leadership Edge, where we talk about how to do that,
right?
But we'd never put down on paper the why.
Right.
And the why is we won't make progress on the toughest challenges facing companies and communities and the world as a whole if we don't get everyone thinking, I have a role to play, and it looks like stepping outside my comfort zone to do some leadership.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, I really love the concept because it's like, so I think about the space. I mean, I think about the big sort of service and experience, and some people call them transformation projects that kind of people go through, and how many of them struggle. And I think many of them struggle because like not everybody's involved in that sort of way. They're almost like playing bit parts, or they're waiting to be told to
like
do.
A cog in a wheel.
Yeah. And so what I wanted to do was to try and highlight a couple of things, or ask you a couple of questions about a couple of things that stood out for me in the book, just to give people a flavor of the book, because we don't want to go through the book soup to nuts, because obviously we want people to buy it and then pass it on and actually buy more copies and give them out to people, because that's how the message spreads. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to start by something that was actually written on the back cover of the book, because the back cover of the book starts by saying, this book is not about leadership. And in brackets, it says, at least not in the way that you think about it. And what I wanted you to do is to sort of explain to me what you meant by that, what you mean by that.
Well, I think still most companies talk about leadership as a person or persons. We talk about a leadership team. And so we are not talking about, we actually think we should abandon the word leader. We should stop talking about leadership teams. We can talk, we need authority, we need structure to get the day-to-day done. But leadership, as we think about it, is challenge-centric. Right. It's about asking, what are big aspirations? What are we most concerned about? And what are the challenges that we actually need everybody paying attention to? And so everybody has to do something different, exercise leadership in their sphere of influence to be able to move something forward. So really, bottom line, it's moving from a person-centric model to a challenge-centric model of leadership.
Perfect. And because when I was going through the book, it's also kind of like, because you start to unpack all of that sort of stuff and think about how it's challenge kind of centric rather than kind of person sort of centric. And then people can like then gather around kind of like tasks and challenges that in terms of kind of like what they can influence and how they can contribute. But, we're not necessarily starting from a blank piece of paper here. You can give people some guidance about what to focus on and how to focus on it. And you use this thing called the gap exercise, where that's apparently a really important element in this approach. And I wanted to ask you, kind of, what is it, and why does it play such a big role?
Yeah, and chapter 5 actually lays out how people can do this with their team, with their company. And the gap exercise is very simple. It's asking, when you think about the future of this company, for instance, or this community, when you think about the future of this company, what concerns you the most?
Yeah.
And we let people talk about that. And we're not going for consensus or agreement. We're just going to get people talking about the dissatisfaction that's likely to be able to fuel them to maybe give up some ways of doing things or move into a slightly uncomfortable space. So we ask that question, and then we follow it with, what are your boldest aspirations? When you think about the future of this company, what are your boldest aspirations? And we get people talking about that. And those are two kinds of conversations where, like, maybe we talk about concerns in companies, but we very rarely couple it with a conversation about that's going to fuel and energize people to get engaged, which is, what are our boldest aspirations? And then there's a third question about what makes progress or leadership difficult in that gap. And we get people talking about things like, there's competing values. I mean, we value collaboration and teamwork, but we also value execution and speed. And too often, maybe that execution and speed value, we sort of implicitly go for that one, and we let collaboration and teamwork fall by the wayside.
Right.
It might be, I mean, there's all kinds of, so competing values come up. The idea that when it comes to our biggest challenges, like a customer experience challenge, for
Sure.
instance, everybody, there's so many different perspectives on what's the real concern or problem and what would our aspirations be. So you get people talking about those. And what's great about that third question, what makes progress hard in the gap, is that it starts to elevate or illuminate ways in to work on the problem.
Right.
Because otherwise we just have our concerns and we complain about those, or we get envisioning sessions and we talk about aspirations, but we don't talk about the things that are holding us in place.
Mm.
Those kinds of conversations, again, they allow people wherever they are in the organization to kind of see how they're contributing to the mess.
Yeah.
Therefore, see possible ways to move things forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I really like that. I mean, it's also because that, as you say, it's like, what are your fears? What are the risks, as it were? Where are the aspirations? But then the idea of what's the blockers? What are the things that are holding us back? What are going to be our anchors? What's the things that are going to stop us breaking out of this current groove and then adopting a different way or a different trajectory? And you're right. I think that is a missing gap. And I wanted to also understand is like, but is there, if you zoom out, is that what stops? Is that third question, is that key to stopping organizations closing that gap?
Yeah, it's absolutely key, because when you avoid that question, you try to deal with the problem or get to the aspiration with a technical approach, meaning like the person at the top can make a plan and delegate and get us there. Mm-hmm. And that works with building a highway interchange, for instance, where an engineer can plot it out and you get the right people with the right expertise. They can build that highway interchange and they can often build it on a schedule. Mm-hmm. But with the more what we call adaptive challenges that are really people challenges,
sure,
you need a different approach. So asking that third question allows people to see the challenge for what it is, and in some ways stop depending on authority to fix it.
Right.
Start thinking about, hey, there's a place for me in this.
Okay. And I guess, yeah, because that's rather kind of waiting for somebody to almost like waiting for somebody to tell you what to do or to remove the obstacles. You're forcing people to confront the problem and actually figure out kind of how they would best kind of do it in a, discursive, constructive sort of way.
Yeah, and like we have done this exercise now with thousands of people, mm-hmm. in, big rooms and in small meetings. And the kind of counterintuitive thing is it's really energizing for people to answer that question and, mm-hmm. to start to see that gap, because it opens up possibilities.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I remember reading a book. I think it's probably one of the most transformative books that I've ever read. And it was a book called Maverick by Ricardo Semler, which I don't know if you know it.
I don't.
So it's a story. Ricardo, if you like, inherited his family's manufacturing kind of business. It was based in Brazil. And Ricardo, by his own admittance, is a bit of a hippie. And he was like, I don't want to be in charge, man. He was like going, I don't want to tell people what to do. But then he had to take it on. Take on the family business. So he did. But then the business ran into hard times, and they were facing the standard way to go about doing things was just to go, right, we're going to cut headcount, cut costs, and then try and ride it out. And he was a bit like, well, I'm not so sure about that. He says, why don't we just ask everybody what to do? tell them what the situation, ask them what they want to do. Said like, here you go, open book. Here's the whole thing. And everybody put their heads together and they were like, rather than actually cutting kind of head count, well, they might have naturally cut head count because there was people who go like, well, I'll retire because I'm 2 months away from it. That's fine. But everybody else went like, well, we don't want to kind of just leave people without jobs. So what we're going to do is we're going to collectively agree. They collectively agreed to reduce their own hours to be able to make sure that they kept everybody on that wanted to stay on, so they could then maintain the their workforce and then work through this thing together. And that was the start of this kind of initiative of this completely reinventing kind of how they used to do things. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. And that was interesting things that from an art of the possible sort of thing. That book was written in the 1980s, which is remarkable and brilliant at the same time. But it's like the idea is like he believed that people know the answer and they have the ability to be brilliant if you just give them the opportunity.
Yeah, and what I love there, and it connects back to how we talk about like how do you start? Often leadership starts with a question.
Yeah,
and he was asking a brilliant, open-ended question, and a series of those, and he was giving the work back to the people who have the biggest stake in it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of, I guess, one way of doing it, but like from your perspective, you talk about this idea about the leadership. We need to move leadership from the many, not the few. And what is that? I wanted to understand kind of what that looks like, because actually that might be people that hold a traditional view might be quite scary and feel slightly kind of like out of control and chaotic sort of thing.
Yeah. I'm serving in the role of interim president and CEO, and we have a culture where we really think about leadership as the job of the many, all 30 staff members, plus our 15 contractors, our board members. Everybody feels like when there's an adaptive challenge, we all have a stake in it and we all have a part to play. And I think the many means everybody's asking themselves, what's my perspective on this? And for instance, in our organization, how do we transform the way we think about leadership development programs so that we really are reaching all Kansans who want to learn these ideas? Right now, we have a set of programs based on a executive education model to a certain extent, and we're actively experimenting to trying all kinds of different ways. So we're reaching people who would never walk into a big conference center and come to a leadership program during the week.
Sure.
So everybody has a stake in that. And you do, though, however, there are technical problems that really demand somebody in a position of authority, whether it's me or one of our other senior team members, creating a policy and just like laying it out so that people can walk through it, or so that people can do their jobs efficiently. And we do run into challenges of like, okay, is this a technical problem where somebody in authority needs to chart it out and everybody else needs to do what they say? Or is this an adaptive challenge? And the way you address that is you make the time to think it through and tell people. If you're the person with the authority, you tell them, I'm approaching this as a technical problem, and here's how we're going to do it. And you also just leave yourself open and have the conversations when somebody thinks you're wrong.
Right.
Because sometimes you're wrong.
And I think, is that the distinction within that? Is like how you apply this is like there's a distinction between technical problems and adaptive problems, and technical ones are going to require, I guess, specific authority.
Yes.
And also domain expertise.
Yes.
In order to challenge. But an adaptive one is something that sits outside that and could actually benefit from. It doesn't benefit from any particular line of authority or any particular domain expertise, but it's it's just different.
Yep. Yeah, and most situations have a little bit of technical and a little bit of adaptive. And it is a role for authority to help people pull those apart.
Okay. And what's the best way to I mean, because that's going to feel kind of really quite strange for some people.
Mm-hmm.
And people go, oh, is that not just about empowerment and stuff? I think, well, it might be.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, I think it feels like it's more of a journey.
Yeah.
And it's just not just a program sort of thing. So, and it will adapt, pardon the pun, to, as people kind of like, as they progress along their own journey, because it's going to be different depending on the people and the problems and the challenges in the organizations. So, in your experience, what's a good way to almost like start engendering that type of culture and that type of behavior in their teams?
Well, one of the reasons we wrote the book is to give people a pretty accessible way to share the ideas. And I mean, literally, I've facilitated a conversation recently with a senior team of a big library where, I mean, and they call themselves right now the leadership team, but during the course of a 5-session book discussion, they started to think, how, I mean, maybe one of the things we need to do right away is change what we call ourselves.
Right.
So, I mean, it's a simple answer from a person who's just written a book, but like grab the book or a chapter in the book and start talking to your people about it. Mm-hmm. And start talking about because shifting your culture is an adaptive challenge.
Yes.
So ask the questions. What's getting in the way of you feeling like you can step a little bit outside your job description and your day-to-day and your task list to be able to help us name and address the big challenges.
Yeah. And I think you talk about this naming thing, and I think that's a really important point, because I think what we call things and how we refer to things matters.
Yeah.
I mean, I was speaking to some people earlier on, and we were talking about vulnerable customers, and they may have different types of vulnerabilities. It might be to do with financial or social, or sort of a disability or something. And I said, one of the fascinating things is that when you start with a descriptor, i.e. vulnerable customers or vulnerable people, one of the things that happens is that you end up getting stuck on the label and you lose sight of the human being. Mm-hmm. Because they are really people, they're always people who have some challenges. They're not challenged people
I'm thinking there too that like when you talk about a group of people as vulnerable people, you're almost denying, I mean, I would be almost denying my own vulnerability and
right. And so I think, and I was explaining that kind of point to them as just like an observation. I said, look, I think we need to be, you might not have a better term to describe them right now, but that does not mean to say that you shouldn't consider kind of like the terminology that you use to describe a set of people and how that might drive your thinking. Because I was talking about making sure that we kind of make sure we examine our own assumptions before we kind of do things. And anyway, that's a bit a slight aside, but I think I mention it because you talk about this idea about recalling ourselves or renaming ourselves as a leadership team. You're like, because, well, if we do that, then maybe it takes off that preconception around what leadership means to some people, and then it opens up the possibility that you're trying to do something else.
Yep.
So, but also one of the things I wanted to ask about the book, because in the book, I really, really liked, because it's not just theory. I mean, and it has a very conversational sort of style, but I really liked how you've used these notes and letters. There's notes and letters kind of like in and out of the book. And I wanted to ask quickly, Are they real or are they fictional? And why did you add them into the book?
Yeah, I'm going to say, what am I going to say? We added them into the book because it was really important to us that people, from the CEO of a company to a volunteer in a small nonprofit, be able to see themselves in the book.
Right.
So there's 25 chapters in the book, and that gave us the opportunity in a less than a page to introduce 25 characters to whom these ideas are applicable. Now, those characters are based on people who have been in this building and in our virtual programs.
Right.
So they are questions that have really been asked of us by people who have been disguised.
Yeah. So it's a sanitized kind of like account of kind of actual questions you've been asked.
And when it got too close for comfort, I went and asked the original people, "Are you okay with this?"
Right.
And,
no, I think it's
every case they said yes, which was exciting to me.
Well, that's also being crumbs. Yeah. It's not very many people when you ask them, like, "Would you like to be in our book?" And they go, "Okay."
Well, but the other thing was that, like, they were willing to let disguised, but their vulnerabilities be on display in a book, and they would know. Maybe nobody else would know, but they would know it was them.
Yeah. What I loved about it was the very idea that it humanizes it, and it actually kind of collapses all the different levels and the preconceptions people have about kind of leadership, and it illustrates kind of through example and real questions about, well, what is this? This is what people are struggling with in terms of what does this mean for me? And here's what I kind of do. What does it mean for me? How I'm struggling with this? Can it help me navigate that? So I thought it was a really nice touch, and it's a perfect addition to the book because it really brings it to life.
Thank you. I'm glad.
Excellent. So one final thing I want to ask, because I don't want to tell everybody everything about the book, but I had to ask you to tell me the story of Thomas Stanley, because I read the story and I started filling up. I got a little bit emotional, and I thought I'd like to ask you to tell me the story of Thomas and the impact that he's had on you and your organization too, because I think it's a story that's worth telling and sharing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I grabbed a cup this morning that says on it, "Live like Thomas."
Right.
We do a Stanley Children's annual fundraiser run to celebrate and remember Thomas, and to raise money for his 3 young children's education. And Thomas started working at the Kansas Leadership Center. I think he took a course at Wichita State that had, some of our ideas in it. And he met our then CEO and my co-author, Ed O'Malley, when he was 21 years old, and came to work at KLC, and he passed away tragically at 33. So Thomas literally grew up at KLC. And Thomas had, especially when he came to KLC early on, had very little technical expertise in anything about life. Though Thomas had a lot to teach me about marriage, and his wife Ashley and her 3 kids are still in our lives. And Thomas, I think Thomas's expertise was actually marriage and family life, and he did it beautifully for the years that he was able to do it. But when it came to being a professional in an office, he had a lot to learn, but he was curious, and he was willing to put himself out there, and he was willing to ask the hard questions. And I mean, he made phone calls. I mean, we got connected to the Islamic Society of Wichita in a pretty Christian state. We got connected to the Islamic Society because Thomas, a staunch Christian himself, went out and invited people to come to KLC. So he was always reaching beyond his comfort zone and reaching beyond the walls of KLC to ask, Who do we need to engage? And he was willing to, he was willing to do it. And sometimes he would speak, and we encourage young professionals to speak up and share a perspective or ask a curious question. And sometimes Thomas would do that in a kind of clumsy way that might get somebody's hackles up. And Ed in particular, as CEO and a mentor to Thomas, would protect would consciously protect Thomas's interventions and sometimes help him in the moment to be heard, and also, coach him on the side to help him be able to ask, better questions. Sure. And to couch his sharing of an interpretation, perhaps as, here's one interpretation of what some people might be thinking, and I just want us to consider this. Yeah. And Thomas he just soaked it up and demonstrated for all of us what it was to live the idea that anyone can lead anytime, anywhere.
Awesome. And I thought I think it was worthwhile kind of sharing kind of the story, and also kind of its continuing impact and the legacy he has on the KLC, because I think that it's worth noting that many people in organizations will encounter these possibly younger people, possibly not younger people, but people that have a curious spirit and an open mind, and an energy about them that you just think, if you help them, feel that they can go off and try and do things, but actually your role is not to control them, but actually to nurture them and protect them and try and kind of guide them and steer them in ways, but actually to not lose sight or sense of that kind of energy, of that curiosity and that sort of drive. And I thought I just wanted to share that, because actually that's the thing in many organizations, and also kind of many kind of big projects where people are trying to change things, is that we sometimes control the spirit out of people. And I think so as an aside, so I, in a previous kind of work, kind of part of my work kind of journey, I trained as a teacher and worked as a teacher. And one of the things that somebody told me about teaching, which I really liked, didn't do it for very long, but really enjoyed it. And they told me that the word education comes from the Latin word educare. I think I pronounced that right. I never studied Latin.
Sounds right. Yep.
But somebody told me that kind of a translation of that word is to bring the light out from within.
Ah, beautiful.
And I think that's a really important part of it. It's trying to bring that light, because people have it.
Yes.
And if you want to have leadership for the many, not the kind of few, I think that's part of it. And I think that's what kind of Ed did with kind of Thomas, is to try and, he saw the light. Yeah.
So that's a role for people with a little bit of authority or positional power to look for the light and help it be brighter.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Anyway, so I hope that gives people a bit of a flavor of the book, where we're kind of going. But is there anything you'd like to highlight that we've missed out before I ask you some couple of questions just to wrap up?
I think what I'd like to highlight is we actually have research that when an organization embraces these ideas and gets people a little bit of training in how to exercise leadership wherever you are in the organizational chart, that they become more engaged in their work, more fulfilled, and happier in their jobs. Awesome. So there's reasons for a company to do this, to embrace this attitude, to address challenges. There's also just sort of workforce retention and engagement reasons to go with this.
Yeah, it's business fundamentals. It will drive, the balance sheet outcomes. Yeah. So thank you for that. So switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you, I continue to reflect on the last kind of 2-3 years that we've had, which would be, I think it'd be an understatement to say that they've been a bit strange and a bit challenging. And what I've been asking people is to reflect on the last couple of years and to think about, well, is there any kind of big things that you've really kind of like learned that have fundamentally changed the way that you work or do things, and it will inform what you do going forward?
I mean, Adrian, on a personal level, I think being sequestered at home for a year with my then 13-year-old son and my husband and some dogs and cats and all that, but being sequestered for a year and actually watching the impact that had on my son and mental health wise, and also just how it felt to come out again on the other side of COVID, whatever this side is, and be much more in person with people. I'm more purposeful about taking moments to connect, whether that's what we're doing virtually or just a moment in person with people. So personally, there's that. The other thing that's been really cool for KLC is we were doing a few programs online, but now we're doing many more programs online than we've been able to reach around the world in different time zones. And we've also had organizations right here in Kansas sending more people virtually to these programs because it doesn't cost them an overnight and travel and all that. And it's just, we've been able to become more accessible. And I'm just so grateful for the skills we were all forced to learn because it's made the idea that leadership is an activity more accessible to more people in our state and outside the state.
Perfect. Thank you. And so just to make it so I always focus largely on things that are related to the improvement of, service experience, customer and employee experience and things. So if I was to say to you, Julia, I want you to boil it down and kind of like give me kind of like, it's probably anathema to the book, but I want you to tell me, kind of like tell the audience what to do. If you were to do one thing, I would advise you to do this. What would that be? What would this be?
Ask questions you don't know the answer to.
Love it. Love that. So before we go, these are the kind of questions I just finish off with and have been finishing off in the last kind of couple of years. And I explained to you before we get started going about the punk questions I've been finishing off, and they're a bit of sort of a fun end to these interviews. So the first one is, what one or two words would you use to describe? What one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to, say, customer experience? What would you say?
I thought of this ahead of time, and then I don't like any of the things I thought of.
Well, I'll tell you what, you can have multiple, it could be a multiple answer or something, and I've got my list here and I'll check them off and I'll tell you if you've got if you got a hit.
So what I want to say, and I don't know if people can get this without reading part 4 of the book. What I want to say is raise the heat.
Well, that's definitely not on the list. I'm going to take that because actually, if I think about from an emotional sort of thing about what did punk do, it raised the temperature. It made a lot of people hot under the collar, right? Yep. And a little bit uncomfortable.
Yep, and it got me down in the mosh pit dancing, and it was very, very warm in there.
There you go. That's kind of it. So I'm going to take that one. no other guesses required. Raise the heat. That will do just nicely. And so the second one is based on this idea that the follow-up book was to Punk CX was Punk XL, and it was around experienced leadership. And it was the idea that we need to, in order to succeed, we need to take a more integrated, holistic, systemic approach to improving experience inside and outside our businesses. And so what I wanted to ask you is like, what one brand or organization do you think is an experienced leader, and sort of why?
Yeah, I'm going to name Pinole Blue, which is a relatively small business here in Wichita, started by Eddie Sandoval. And he got in a truck and went down to Chihuahua, Mexico to bring home Pinole because he thought people in Wichita and across the United States needed that drink.
Right.
To feel their running and their energy. And ultimately, they just needed really good Pinole Blue tortillas. And Eddie has, he's continued in that kind of just get in the truck and go down to Mexico and bring back the blue corn, that spirit. And he gives back to the community in Mexico where this corn is grown. And he's all over TikTok trying to reach the people who are going to love what he's doing.
Awesome. And just for people that are listening to this, if they wanted to look them up, Pinole, is that Pinole?
Yep.
Perfect. Pinole Blue, ladies and gentlemen, check them out. One final thing before we go, because as I say, I find myself, it's the 2020 and 2021 were challenging. 2022 is a bit weird, and there's all sorts of stuff kind of going on. We thought, couldn't get any stranger, but it seems to have just rolled on. And I find myself wanting to highlight good news stories or things that just make us smile, because as a diversion from the doom scrolling that I often find myself doing. So before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, what's the most interesting, positive, or exciting thing that you've seen in the last week?
Adrian, I know I had an answer to this like an hour and a half ago, and I should have written it down. I live in Matfield Green, Kansas. It is a community of 50 people, 3.5 people per square mile. And I just see every day people who think very differently about politics and some of those kind of basics, and who have very different backgrounds, coming together to around the idea of how much we love this place on the Flint Hills Prairie. And I don't know, I think what I would say is in the last week, I've just gotten 2 or 3 emails from like the person who manages the water system and trash system to the person who's working on an artist residency, to the person who's working on celebrating ranching history in the Kansas Flint Hills. It's these people coming at the challenge of keeping this community alive from different perspectives. And I see it every day, every week in my inbox, and actually like on my drive home or my runs and walks around the teeny little neighborhood where I live. Excellent.
Well, that's a nice thing. Kind of neighborhoods and community. More power to it. So, Julia, that's all I have. I've exhausted my list.
All right.
So I just want to say thank you for spending some time with me today and telling me a bit about sharing a bit of your story and your perspective and your insight, and also telling me a little bit about the book. And congratulations to yourself and to Ed for writing this book and the work that you do at the KLC. So thanks all round. It's been great.
Adrian, this made my day. Thank you.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. Do tune in again. Thanks very much.